Good afternoon on this threatening day. I am Steve Swain, a professor of music here at Dartmouth College and the director of the Montgomery Fellows Program. We gather today on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Western Abenaki who were and are part of the Wabanaki Confederation. The Montgomery Fellows Program brings exceptional people to an exceptional place. That exceptional place, of course, is Dartmouth College, but it is also the Montgomery House on Ockham Pond, which was purchased in 1977 through the generosity of Kenneth Montgomery, class of 1925, and his wife, Harl. Our fellow today, the college's 270th resident fellow, comes to share with us his life and wisdom. The Montgomery Fellows Program extended an invitation to our current fellow primarily because of the passionate and persuasive advocacy from one of my dearest colleagues. Mark Williams is Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at Dartmouth College, where, among other things, he directs an NEH-supported DH research initiative. Maybe you're going to have to say more about what those initials stand for. National Endowment for the Humanities supported Digital Humanities Initiative entitled the Media Ecology Project, which is developing a virtuous cycle of new interdisciplinary scholarship about archival media that adds value back to participating archives. Alongside John Bell, Mark has received multiple NEH grants in support of the Media Ecology Project, to enable them to develop tools and scholarship. He is currently working on a Mellon Foundation grant about performance capture data regarding U.S. narrative moving image history, and he has published widely on cinema, television, and new media history and theory. I have asked Mark to introduce our fellow to you, so will you join me, please, in welcoming Mark Williams?
Well, I truly appreciate you coming out on a day that is threatening to be nasty. It's absolutely fine right now. I don't think anybody has to be searching their tweets for weather updates. We're going to be okay for the length of this program. But it's an extraordinary pleasure to welcome Professor Vincenz Hedegaard, who is professor at Goethe University. He runs many research projects there, including a research training program called Configurations of Film, and an area studies project, Cultural Entrepreneurship and Digital Transformation in Africa and Asia. He is one very busy colleague, and we actually hope to be working with him on various of these endeavors. He's an internationally renowned scholar and writer, a leader in film and media studies within the European Academy. For example, he's the co-founder of NECS, which is the European version of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies here in America. A driving force in multiple significant cultural initiatives, especially in relation to the universities and archives in Frankfurt, and he'll say more about that, and across Central Europe. He's currently the project leader for those endeavors that I just mentioned. In this talk, we'll learn much more about his groundbreaking work to engage with scholars, archivists, and filmmakers, particularly in Africa, to locate, preserve, and study the rich moving image histories of Nigeria and Ghana, set in the context of 21st century dynamic shifts in national and global cultural production and distribution. One of the ways that I think about Vincenz's transformative work is, in a way, he's modulating beyond what we know to have occurred in some delimited way in post-war France, post-World War II France, where people who were dedicated cineasts learning about what was at the time sort of a 50-year history of motion pictures really transformed the way that many people think about those industries. And thank heavens, transformed the way people thought about American cinema, which a great many people, many of them social scientists, just sort of dismissed as factory product. And who could possibly take that seriously, especially in some kind of artisanal or elevated way? Well, it completely transformed how people think about cinema and their relationship to it. And it's not an entirely bald stretch of the imagination to suggest that there's a reason you're sitting in a beautiful, comfortable motion picture theater in the Ivy League. And there's some tendrils back to that transformation. Vincennes comes, of course, later, and really starts to demonstrate some of the paucity and some of the aporia in those assumptions. They did have a sense that they knew what film history was. It was really film history of the West, and primarily of America and Europe. There weren't great strides in terms of understanding it as an international forum. There were inklings of thinking about it in certain post-colonial and decolonial ways, but all of that was still to come. And Vincennes is one of the leaders in helping to think about that. He has a very synthetic and at the same time critically dialectical mind. When you read his work, I'm impressed by the range of his knowledges and the discourses that he undertakes. But he really does think about, whether, I'm sure it's consciously, something like a dialectics of an argument. And he'll pit things against one another that you might have read as merely complementary, and he'll introduce a third term, and he'll take us to places that we haven't thought about before. And that's part of what's so compelling about his work. Two of his most famous interventions in the publishing world have to do with a whole other side of a voluminous history of moving images, which is thinking about what he calls films that work. Films that were well outside of the canon, films that were massively produced as industrial films, as educational films, as what today very readily falls under the rubric of what we call orphan cinema, and also changes the way that we imagine film as an international art form in terms of circulation and edification, or the opposite of that, kind of a ham-fisted sense of propaganda, and really opens so many new avenues of discourse and research for us to pursue. So it's an extraordinary pleasure to welcome him here to Dartmouth, and especially to address us today. Please welcome Vincennes Hedegaard.
Well, thank you, Steve, for opening the proceedings and being such a wonderful host. Thank you, Mark, for this overly generous introduction. But it's fantastic to be here. As I keep on telling people, the Montgomery Fellowship is the greatest gig in academia. I highly recommend it. It comes with a great house and a lot of attention from wonderful people, and it's certainly been one of the best experiences of my life as an academic so far. I want to start off by thanking my hosts, the president of the university, Sian Belloc, who I've had a chance to meet yesterday, and who is very, very impressive. I want to thank the provost, Dave Coates, the vice provost, Barbara Will, and of course my two nominators, Professor Ayo Coley and Mark Williams. I want to thank again Steve for his wonderful hospitality that he's offered us. And I want to thank in particular someone who couldn't be here because she's traveling, but who has been so immensely helpful to us in our stay here, Ellen Henderson, who manages hospitality in the Montgomery Fellowship Program and has been there on call around the clock when we we didn't figure out how to use the washing machine and other things, and introduced us to the life and culture of Hanover in a truly wonderful, wonderful way. Okay, my talk today is entitled African Giants and the American Hegemon, A New World Order of Cultural Production. That's a quote, and then there's a question mark. Somewhat over 10 years ago, I boarded a plane from Frankfurt, Germany, where I live and teach, to Melbourne, Australia, to attend the conference. It was a plane operated by one of the Gulf State Airlines. The total flight time was, of course, over 20 hours, so I checked out the in-flight entertainment. Rather than just the latest Hollywood films and a few European art house pictures that you would find on an American or European airline, I found out that I had access to more than 400 films, and films from all over the world, including all Indian film industries, Korean films, Middle Eastern and South Asian films. And in order to recreate that experience, I took this screenshot of Emirates in-flight entertainment program website yesterday, and you get a sense of the categories here. This does not at all recommend to what we've been teaching in intro to film courses. There's a special category, by the way, Penelope Cruz's favorites, and that has to do with the fact that Penelope Cruz is currently a brand ambassador for Emirates. What that selection told me was that the Gulf Airlines knew their audience. Anticipating the end of the fossil fuel era, the Gulf states went looking for a sustainable foundation for their prosperity beyond fossil fuels. Their solution has been and continues to be a mix of air travel, tourism, culture, and education. To this mix, the airlines are key. Draw an 8-hour flight radius around the Gulf, and you reach 2/3 of the Earth's population. What you see here is the current network of Emirates. These are all the destinations that you can fly to from Dubai. And in almost none of the countries within that 8-hour radius, the first language is English. What I was seeing on my Emirates airline screen was also a clear sign of what, in a book published in 2019, Pakistani writer Fatima Bhutto described somewhat tongue-in-cheek and with a reference to an American post-Cold War slogan from the early 1990s, the New World Order of Cultural Production. An order in which global megacities like Lagos, Istanbul, Mumbai, or Seoul emerge as new production centers and primary markets for films, television, and music, and in which, in this order, these new production centers radiate across the globe. In 1969, two filmmakers from Argentina, Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino, published a manifesto entitled Hacia un tercer cine, for a third cinema. First cinema was Hollywood, the global hegemon. Second cinema was European cinema, auteur films. Third cinema, in Solanas and Getino's understanding, was the militant cinemas of the former colonies, including South America and Africa, a cinema designed to challenge the first two and to change the world in the process. What I was looking at on board the Emirates plane were numerous other cinemas beyond the wildest imaginations of Solanas and Getino, new cinemas too numerous to count. But you don't have to hop on a Gulf State plane for this kind of experience. Today, it's enough to log on to your Netflix account, and you will have similar access to the latest films and TV shows from Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world. This is a screenshot of what comes up if you type Nigeria into your search window, and it's just the beginning of a very, very large catalog. As Dartmouth President C.M. Belloc told me in that conversation yesterday, she has never watched as many international films as she has since signing up for Netflix. So is Fatima Bhutto right? Is this a new world order of cultural production? And what is more, is it a more just and maybe even revolutionary new order which challenges the hegemony of the US and Europe? Or are we merely seeing new cultural players being co-opted into an existing political and economic order, the order of global capitalism? The difference is important and consequential. In terms proposed by the political philosopher Olufemi Taiwo, we could describe this difference as a difference between a politics of deference and a constructive politics. Is the new diversity and choices of films and cultural programs merely another case of deference politics, of deferring to the underprivileged in the room, of generously and in a partly slightly condescending way granting a voice to the less fortunate without really challenging the setup of the room? Or do we witness, when we log on to Netflix and fly Emirates, do we witness the building of an entirely new house with new rooms where power is more equitably distributed across the world? Ultimately, the question I want to ask is what a constructive politics of culture, a constructive politics in the sense of Taiwo, would have to look like, a cultural politics capable of bringing about structural and not just superficial transformations. Now, for some reason, in her book, Fatima Bhutto, in her book, The New Kings of the World, Fatima Bhutto does not mention Africa. Her examples are Turkey, India, and Korea. Today, I want to take this omission as an invitation. In trying to assess whether there truly is a new world order of cultural production, whether we can read the Emirates and Netflix menus as results of a constructive politics of culture, I want to focus on Africa and on West Africa in particular. Why Africa? To quote Flora Gomes, a filmmaker from Guinea-Bissau and director of one of the masterpieces of African cinema, Morto Nega, Those Whom Death Refuses from 1988, quote, "If you don't know Africa, you don't know anything, because Africa is where it all started." Nigeria, the African giant, to quote the title of a recent album by Afrobeat superstar Burna Boy, a Nigerian artist, has emerged as a global player in the film and music industries over the last 3 decades. Film and music are now the second most important export of Nigeria after oil and gas. Nigerian films reach audiences in Africa, the Caribbean, and across the world through satellite channels like Ebony Life TV, a company based in Lagos but broadcasting across West Africa and the Caribbean, through African Magic, a satellite channel based in South Africa, and through streaming platforms like Iroko TV, an alternative to Netflix based again in Lagos, Showmax, and of course Netflix itself. It is an industry composed of multiple production centers and producing in multiple languages, with Lagos and the northern Nigerian city of Kano, the largest city in the Sahel and the center of the Hausa film industry, being the main hubs. It is also an industry in which women wield a lot of power, certainly more than in Hollywood. Women like Ebony Life TV founder and owner Mo Abudu, a Nigerian born in Britain, or actor, director, producer, she has fans here, that's good, or actor, director, producer Genevieve Naji, arguably one of the most famous female artists in contemporary Africa, whose work, again, you can find on Netflix. As for my own speaking position, it has been one of my great pleasures and privileges to work in Nigeria and with Nigerian partners for the last 7 years on a project for a master program at the University of Jos and the Nigerian Film Institute in Jos, which trains film archivists and specialists in film culture and uses the National Film, Video, and Sound Archive in Jos, the National Film Archive of Nigeria, as its training ground. The aim of that project is to create a pool of specialists which can preserve Nigeria's rich audiovisual heritage, which is, like any audiovisual heritage, threatened by loss, but who can also anticipate the challenges in film preservation for digital formats as Nigeria's multifaceted film industries increasingly move from a production model focused on novelty and rapid production cycles to a model based on the exploitation of copyrights and the long-term circulation of individual films. With a focus on Nigeria, then, I want to discuss whether what we are seeing on the in-flight entertainment screens of the Gulf Airlines and on Netflix represents a transformation of the global order of cultural production, and whether it might even be the kind of revolutionary transformation that Solanas and Chetino were hoping for 50 years ago. I want to preface my answer with a note on method, so to speak. I want to ask two questions. Is it wise to expect so much from culture? No less than a contribution to a more just political and economic order, because usually we assume that it's the other way around. And is it wise to expect such a social transformation from cultural industries, that is, from capital, labor, and technology-intensive models of production and distribution, that is, from a form of culture which seems inextricably tied up in the existing order of global capitalism? Let me answer the first question first. Here, I can merely cite some of the most important voices of the anti-colonial struggle of the 20th century, like Aimé Césaire, the Caribbean intellectual and political leader, who, together with Léopold Sédar Senghor, poet and later president of Senegal, coined the term négritude, or Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the anti-colonial struggle against Portugal in Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau, who, through that struggle, also ended up liberating Portugal from the last remnant of European fascism. Their answer is that, of course, culture matters. Césaire and Senghor were politicians and poets. Césaire's poetic oeuvre includes a decolonial rewriting of Shakespeare's The Tempest, among many, many other things. Cabral, in turn, argued that, quote, national liberation is necessarily an act of culture, unquote. Culture, for Cabral, is a resource for transformation. Colonization happened first with the force of the cannon and then in the schoolroom, as Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o reminds us. Cultural production is one way through which this power differential may be reversed. The second question, should we expect something approaching revolutionary change? Oops. There we are. The second question, should we exactly. This is where the technology interferes. The substructure doesn't want this question to be articulated. The second question, should we expect something approaching a revolutionary change from cultural industries, is maybe a bit thornier to answer. I come here from Frankfurt, Germany, which is the home of what is probably still the most recognizable global brand in critical theory today, also known as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School legacy is a great gift. Film studies in Germany evolved as what today would be described as a queer/feminist project directly out of critical theory in Frankfurt in the 1970s. Adorno died in 1969, and some of his most brilliant students decided to turn their backs on philosophy and move to the cinema instead. And they became the first generation of film professors in Germany. But that legacy can also be a burden, particularly when it comes to the study of cultural industries. One of the most influential texts associated with the Frankfurt School is a book co-authored by philosophers Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno and Max Horkheimer entitled The Dialectic of Entitlement, written during the two authors' American exile from Nazi Germany and first published in English in Amsterdam in 1947. In that book, Adorno and Horkheimer argue that the Enlightenment, the 19th century philosophical movement towards the rationalization of the world, had, in the course of the 19th and 20th century, turned upon itself, reduced to an unfettered, purely instrumental rationality. Reason had turned into an enemy of all the values professed by the Enlightenment, including freedom, equality, justice, and the autonomy of the individual. Instrumental rationality, that's the key argument of the book, had laid the groundwork for the Holocaust of the European Jews and things like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In what has become probably the most influential chapter in the dialectic of enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno assign a key role in this deplorable outcome to the cultural industries and to the industrialization of the arts. Cinema is a particular target of Adorno's critical fervor. In one of his later books, the influential collection of philosophical fragments entitled Minima Moralia, Adorno writes, "Jedes Mal, wenn ich ins Kino gehe, komme ich dümmer und schlechter wieder heraus. Every time I go to the movies, I come out a cognitively and morally degraded person." Which of course begs the question, why does he keep on going back? But therein lies the crux of the argument. For Adorno and Horkheimer, cultural industries entangle their audiences in degrading experiences from which it is impossible to disentangle oneself. The remedy for Adorno is the avant-garde, atonal music in the vein of Anton Webern and Arnold Schönberg, with whom the young Adorno, a gifted pianist, had studied composition, abstract painting, and the austere drama of a Samuel Beckett. To put it in the terms of Olufemi Taiwo's metaphor, for Adorno and Horkheimer, the culture industries could never rebuild the house. The cultural industry is the house, but as a prison. All rooms in it are cells, and all doors are locked. Our only hope for escape is advanced modernism. It took a thinker like Stuart Hall and the cultural studies of the so-called Birmingham School of the 1960s and 1970s to figure out that things were not all that bad, that audiences did in fact have agency and could make sense of what they experienced in their encounters with products of the cultural industries on their own terms. But to acknowledge that spectators have agency does not necessarily entail a challenge to the structures of production. To find out whether cultural industries have the potential to not only change the room, but to build a new house, I want to move backwards from Adorno and Horkheimer to the 1930s and Swiss philosopher Denis de Rougemont. Like world-class Swiss tennis players, Swiss philosophers are few and far between, but they do exist. In 1936, Denis de Rougemont published a book entitled Pensez avec les mains, Thinking with Your Hands. This, incidentally, is another book about what was then a new world order of cultural production. Incidentally, de Rougemont wrote his book in Frankfurt, where he taught at the university in 1935-36 as a lecturer for French and witnessed National Socialism firsthand. In the book, de Rougemont makes the exact same argument about the Enlightenment and its dialectic as Adorno and Horkheimer only 10 years earlier. And like Adorno after him, de Rougemont saw the arts as a decisive stage where this drama played out. But his analysis had an important twist. De Rougemont argued that in industrial modernity, the arts have been sundered from practical life and become a separate realm of inconsequential enjoyment. This was the bourgeois world of the 19th century and early 20th century. On the other hand, there were the totalitarian systems of the 20th century, fascism and Bolshevism, which attempted to restore the unity of practical life and the arts by turning aesthetics into a concern of the state, a top-down mandated form of unified expression to which everyone was a subject, and to which everyone who was a subject of the state had to conform. Obviously, neither of these alternatives was acceptable to de Rougemont. Instead, he proposed what he described as a socialist revolution, a new order of culture and society in which the separation of culture and industry and the subjugation of culture under the order of the state were both reversed, and an order in which the work and arts came together once again in what de Rougemont called thinking with one's hands. So de Rougemont's point was again in Olufemi Taiwo's metaphor that there are two houses, one a large factory with an adjacent spa for regeneration through the arts, known as bourgeois capitalism, and the other a set of very large prisons with a coherent interior design known as the totalitarian states. The challenge, as de Rougemont put it, was to build a new house by thinking with your hands. Now, one could argue that de Rougemont is advocating for a return to the artisanal against the industrial, and that he's implicitly building a new opposition between artisanal culture and industrialized culture. If so, he would only be a belated representative of the arts and crafts movement of the 19th century. But I would argue that his argument is actually more forward-looking and relevant to what we are facing today. And not just because we're facing a resurgence of fascism in pretty much all parts of the world. Rather, de Rougemont's argument is forward-looking because for him, how we think with our hands depends on the technologies at hand. And if we use the technologies properly, then thinking with your hands becomes possible. With de Rougemont, we can think of the digital as artisanal and of digital culture as a new artisanal culture, which overcomes both the division of labor of the traditional capitalist and the top-down conformist of the totalitarian state aesthetics. Now, how does this thinking with our hands concept apply to contemporary cinema and to cultural industries in Africa in particular? Today, almost everyone owns a smartphone, a powerful pocket computer with more computing capability as the ones that put a man on the moon, which also happens to be a film camera and a portable cinema. On a recent trip to Lagos, Chike Madwegbunga, the head of an important production facility, Afrinoli Hub in Ikeja, Lagos, showed me his smartphone, presented his smartphone and said, "We are making movies for this." Nigeria is a country with an estimated population of 200 million. More than 50% of Nigerians now have smartphones and online access. Making movies adapted to smartphone screens makes a lot of sense if that is your market. But Madwegbunga could also have shown me his smartphone and said, "We are making movies with this." And he could have gone one step further and said, "We didn't wait for the digital and the smartphone revolution to start thinking with our own hands. We started earlier with video." As a matter of fact, the new Nigerian film industry was started by salesmen for consumer electronics imported from Taiwan. In the early 1990s, the so-called Structural Adjustment Program imposed by the International Monetary Fund forced the Nigerian government to cut back on public expenditures. Among the first items to go on the chopping block was the state-sponsored film industry, including the fiction production for the National Television Authority, the national broadcaster. For a moment, Nigeria faced a unique problem, an undersupply of filmed entertainment. That never happens. Enterprising dealers of consumer electronics like Kenneth Nebue filled the void. In the hope of being able to sell more video recorders, they bought video cameras and started making their own films on video. Tapping into the pool of acting and technical talent made redundant by the structural adjustment program, they started producing films like Living in Bondage, Nebue's now legendary 1992 debut film, which was first produced in Igbo, the regional language of and dominant language of southeastern Nigeria, and then remade in English, which made it an even bigger success. Nebue wrapped the videotapes in cellophane to make them look more like imported American films to drive sales, which turned out to be a good marketing strategy. He scored a massive hit, which led to a lot of imitators joining the filmmaking business. And at that time, like early Hollywood, thresholds to entry were really low. You could sell your cab, buy a video camera, and become a movie mogul. Out of this initial success emerged a massive industry which is now creating more jobs than any other sector in Nigeria. Nigerian film scholar Ikechukwu Obiaya, I'm sorry I'm butchering the name, has argued that this new industry, Nollywood, although Nollywood is mainly the term for the English language sector of the industry, the Hausa language industry in Kano is known as Kannywood, for instance. Obiaya has argued that this new industry can be understood in terms of a bottom-up project for decolonization. Most of post-independence film production in Nigeria was still informed by Western and European ideas, inherited from the British, through the institutional continuity between the State Production Agency and the Colonial Film Unit, but also generated in universities. A top-down idea of Brechtian drama as a means of conscientization of the masses was the dominant model, a combination of Brecht and the decolonial pedagogy of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian philosopher and thinker. This is a conception of culture developed particularly in universities, like Amadou Bello University in Zaria, or the universities of Ibadan and Nsukka, and then sort of percolated down to film production. Nollywood, and I'm showing you here a recently digitized frame from a film that the Nigerian Film Corporation made about its own production unit, and what we're seeing here is a film crew on location in central Nigeria in Plateau State. Nollywood was very, very different. It was different from previous Nigerian films, but also very different from the many African films made with European money, mostly French money, and shown primarily at European and American festivals and in art house theaters. It was, as it turned out, a truly popular cinema, one which managed to resonate with very broad audiences by projecting a community's social concerns on screen, and one which very soon reached out to different territories and across Western Africa and the Caribbean. As I was saying, Victor Okoye, one of the key figures in the early history of Nollywood, once said to me, we're doing now to the rest of Africa what the Americans were doing to us in the 1970s. We're the new cultural imperialists. That's how influential Nollywood became. It was also, as I would argue, that new industry, an example of thinking with one's hands and effecting transformative change, a textbook case of a constructive politics of culture. Filmmakers like Nebue did not wait for the permission of cultural gatekeepers or the support of government agencies, but just went ahead, used the technologies at hand, and created films that people obviously wanted to see, and in the process built on their own terms an entirely new cultural industry. And they did so very significantly by addressing their audience in their own language, and quite literally, or languages. English sometimes, which is now the official language of Nigeria, of course, the national language, but all the other regional languages or African languages spoken in Nigeria, Igbo, Yoruba, Benin, and, as mentioned before, Hausa, a language spoken by more than 60 million people across northern Nigeria and the Sahel. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan novelist and political thinker who I've mentioned before, has argued in this book from 1986 and in his work since that the decolonizing the mind requires writing in African languages, that it requires a transition away from an African literature written in the language of the colonizers. Think of one of the previous Montgomery Fellows, Chinua Achebe, who wrote exclusively in English and had his breakthrough as the first major English language African novelist with Things Fall Apart in 1959, a book that borrows its title from a poem by W.B. Yeats, which is a significant sort of entanglement in British culture. So Thiong'o argues for the use of a literature, he argues for a literature written in Amharic, Kiswahili, Hausa, Wolof, or any of the other of the hundreds of African languages. For a writer, this is a difficult choice because it usually means losing the Western audience, at least temporarily and sometimes permanently. It also means, because of the economy of the literature business, risking their livelihood. Cinema, if it is a popular art form, appears to be different, as the success of all the regional film industries across Nigeria illustrates. The new Nigerian film industry seemed to meet Thiong'o's standard for a decolonized cultural production with ease. A friend of mine who specializes in French film theory and art house films asked me a few years ago whether I thought that Nigerian cinema would ever have its modernist moment, as he said. I instantly shot back and said, I certainly hope not. Striving for a modernist aesthetic would mean for African filmmakers to submit once again to an European model of art history. It would mean to accept that one has an underdevelopment problem and needs to catch up with European or American models. Nollywood films are hardly ever shown in Western festivals, which is why my friend, who catches most of his films at festivals, had never seen one. But the new African films do not need the recognition awarded by European and American gatekeepers. They have their audience, and they thrive on that relationship, a relationship, by the way, with a popular audience that European filmmakers at this point can only dream of. Now, I want to conclude by briefly turning from the African giants in my title to the other element of the title, the American hegemon. And I want to try to give at least a preliminary answer to my initial great general question, namely whether what we're seeing on Netflix and on in-flight entertainment menus constitutes revolutionary change, the building of a new house, or whether it constitutes merely a redecoration of the same old roots. The question of whether cultural industries can have a positive effect and affect positive change, I think I have tried to answer in the affirmative with a view to Nigeria. Hollywood's century-old global ascendancy rests on two pillars: distribution and the ability to make films that everyone around the globe can understand and project their concerns onto. As film historian Douglas Gomery once noted, distribution, the ability to deliver films to audiences in cinemas or platforms, is the least glamorous sector of the film industry. I don't think anyone has a poster of a distribution executive on the wall in their childhood bedrooms. They don't even exist. But it would be a nice idea. By the way, one of the vice presidents of Dartmouth, Orton Hicks, who was vice president from 1958 to the mid-60s and is recorded in the history of Dartmouth as its most successful fundraiser of all time, was a distribution executive in his previous life. He was a pioneer of 16 millimeter film in the 30s and then worked for MGM in the post-war period. So if you want to put a poster of a distributor on your wall, just go to the Dartmouth archive and pull a picture of Orton Hicks. But distribution, despite being the least glamorous sector of the film industry, is, as Douglas Gomery said, the key to market control. The United States are a country the size of a continent. Until very recently, when China caught up, it was by far the largest cinema market in the world. What we know as Hollywood is really a group of distributors with the ability to leverage the size of their home market into global dominance and show films to anyone who was interested at any time around the globe. The second point concerns the films themselves. The films Hollywood makes are American films, but they are strategically designed to not exclude anyone, to the point where they often accommodate several mutually incompatible readings, a strategy for which film scholar Thomas Elsesser has coined the wonderful term structural ambiguity. Hollywood still maintains these two strengths, and there is no realistic scenario in which the geographical advantages of the American film industry and its ability to speak a culturally indifferent global vernacular will wane. We also need to note that the new kings of the world, to quote Fatima Bhutto's book title again, including Nollywood and Korean films, owe a good part of their new global visibility to a streaming platform like Netflix. Netflix, of course, is an American company headquartered in Hollywood. So in order to build a new house in the world of cultural production, you need the ability to think with your hands, but you also need logistics or distribution. If we look at Nigeria, we can see that some of the key players in that industry are actually distributors rather than simply producers. Iroko TV, the streaming platform, is a good example. Ebony Live TV, the satellite chain and production house that I already mentioned. What they do is not yet a comprehensive threat to Hollywood's ascendancy, but for the time being, I would argue it's good enough. And as the recent success of Korean films and TV dramas has shown, non-English programs can also approach something like the status of a global vernacular. Our students now learn Korean rather than English and apply to graduate programs in Seoul rather than London. Give it time. Hausa could be next. And what Nigeria now has is certainly good enough if your goal is not global dominance, which is and continues to be the goal of Hollywood, but simply the freedom to think with your own hands. So to briefly summarize, the answers to my questions, can cultural industries affect positive change? And are we currently witnessing such positive change, the emergence of a new world order, are as follows. Yes, the cultural industries can have positive change, and I would always turn to Nigeria and Nollywood to find evidence for that. And for the second point, it's important to remember that distribution is the key to market control and hence also to building a new house. While Hollywood will not be dislodged anytime soon from its position as the global hegemon, we are seeing new players on the global scene, not just in production, but in the all-important realm of distribution, including players from Africa, new players which create new audiences without ceding control to the established players. And that is what matters now and will matter in the immediate future. But I will let one of the masters of African cinema have the last word. Sembène Ousmane, the writer and film director from Senegal, who is an important inspiration, by the way, for many of the current Nigerian film directors. Sembène also had something important to say about the geography of cultural production in this interview from the 1980s, which was recorded on the Croisette in Cannes during the film festival.
Est-ce que vos films sont bien compris en Europe?
Non mais mettons-nous bien ça dans la tête. Moi, l'Europe n'est pas mon centre. L'Europe est une périphérie de l'Afrique. Vous voyez, ils sont restés plus de 100 ans chez moi, ils n'ont pas parlé ma langue, je parle leur langue. L'avenir, pour moi, l'avenir ne dépend pas d'être compris par l'Europe. Je souhaiterais qu'ils me comprennent, mais ça ne me fait absolument rien. Si vous prenez la carte de l'Afrique, géographiquement, vous pouvez mettre l'Europe et l'Amérique, il nous resterait encore de la place. Pourquoi voulez-vous que ce tropisme, vous savez, le tropisme, pourquoi voulez-vous que je sois comme le tournesol qui tourne autour du soleil? Je suis moi-même le soleil.
Thank you very much for your attention. Okay. Okay. We can do the chair. I don't know, what do you suggest we do? Stay at the podium for the Q&A? Podium is good. Okay, we can start here on the chairs. Okay. I'll grab the chair. Yeah, great. Not only do you have the most incredible cinema space, you also have director's chairs. That's great.
Not quite?
Now,
It is news. It is. So we'll open it up to Q&A in just a second. I hope that people will have many questions. Let me follow up a little bit with, just to return to some of the published work you've done about industrial films and orphan films and films that work and so forth. Does this play a role in the kind of it's not exactly linear, but the kind of argumentative thread that you've produced here?
yeah, thanks for the question. If there is a through line, I would say I'm always interested in intersections of the economy and the arts, and economic organization and the arts. So one of the first things I wrote was a book on trailers, which hopefully soon is finally coming out in English. And there I was interested in how that undervalued art form reflects the economic logics of the film production system. And industrial film is another key to that. It's, again, a totally overlooked form of filmmaking that falls through the cracks of the valuation parameters that we have established in film studies and in academia, but is actually a key to an understanding of how audiovisual media really work in the real world. And in a way, you could say there's a through line to what I just talked about, because my fascination with Nollywood really started with the fact that there was a film industry in a place where there shouldn't be. And that the entrepreneurial spirit and energy of these people created something that nobody had really anticipated, nobody had any understanding for, and I think we're still a bit in the phase. I mean, the literature on Nollywood is growing, but we're still in the phase where it's hard to come to terms with what really happened there. I sometimes just go through the programs of SCMS and Next and count the numbers of papers on Nollywood. They're always in the single digits. Right now, that is a completely undervalued area of research, and so I think that will be the through line. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And there's another thought that I had, and we were talking about this in class earlier, which is a kind of legacy of something like a neorealist aesthetic and use of long takes and putting characters in a position where they're confronting the institutions that they're unfamiliar with, but that produce such a structure that has a certain grasp on their everyday life, and whether that also has a relationship to at least some of the success in Nigeria and other places.
Yeah, I mean, whenever I visit the German embassy in Abuja, there's always someone who will tell me that these films are ridiculous. And I keep on wondering why they have the urge to tell me that, you know. Why don't these people fall in line and start making real movies? They're completely missing the point. They are not the audience, but there is an audience, and that audience responds to these films, and it describes their lives, and it makes sense of their lives in really, really important ways. And so I think neorealism is really a good point of comparison, because that was a cinema that was also made under similar conditions of economic duress. There was a similar kind of energy. And it turned out for a short moment to be a cinema that was critically acclaimed, but also very, very popular. It's also interesting to compare, of course, the Nigerian situation to Korea, where we currently have a genre-based popular cinema that also makes important statements about Korean history and Korean society and wins all the awards abroad. So it's important to remember that a film like Parasite actually sells 11 million tickets at the box office in Korea and is a massive hit that blows most of the Hollywood films that come out in South Korea out of the water. So in a way, there's a really similar constellation in Nigeria. What's missing is the cultural approbation of Western observers. But again, you know, I don't think Kunle Afolayan gets up in the morning. By the way, I mean his films are part of the so-called new Nollywood. They have higher production values, very reflective storylines, multiple layers of meaning. You can read them as a contribution to the debate about Pan-Africanism and world-making beyond the nation-state, but they're also entertainment. But I don't think Kunle Afolayan gets up in the morning and thinks, what do I have to do to get into the Cannes Film Festival? He really doesn't care, and he doesn't have to. And I think that's what we need to understand.
That's great. That's great. Last question. A little more about Netflix. So in terms of the hegemon and so forth, and is it a breakthrough for that there are that many Nigerian films on Netflix? It feels like it, but maybe I don't know quite how to think about that sort of contradiction.
Yeah, I mean, any statistic that Netflix publishes is highly suspicious. You know, my students always want to write papers about the data side of Netflix, and I always have to tell them, you can't, because you have no access. Nobody does. They're a data company, and they're certainly not telling anyone what's really happening, not least because they don't want to be sued by artists who realize that their films are more successful than what they're getting paid for. There's a lawsuit there right now, but that is part of why they're keeping everything under wraps. I think what the great achievement of Netflix is to have created what I like to call a global in-between space between national cinematographies and the global hegemony of Hollywood. And it's a really unique space where you can find a lot of stuff that you would not normally have access to, where these films gain new audiences across the world that they would not normally reach. So that I would say is a net positive. One of the things that Netflix does in Europe, for instance, is turbocharge the careers of young filmmakers at a price. So they step in, talk to recent film school graduates and tell them, here's a budget, make something for us, but sign the rights over to us. So if it's a hit, all the other language versions and all the revenue that comes out of that film will go to Netflix. But still, for young filmmakers, that's still a good deal, because they get to work with budgets that if they had to go through the public funding structures in Germany, they would never have access to at this early stage in their career. So they can gain experience, and if they're good, they'll get more work. So those are all net positives, I would say. One of the things is that in Nigeria, the Netflix subscription costs 10 times as much as the Iroko TV subscription. So it's actually sort of an upper middle class phenomenon. And most people in Nigeria will watch their films in Iroko. simply for pecuniary reasons. It's a purchasing power problem. But yeah, I mean, I think we need to stay wary of Netflix, but it does a lot of good things for our map of world cinema.
So please, any of you that might have questions, I think there's a microphone that you can access, but we can also probably hear you and I can repeat your question. If you have a question, please don't be shy. We can see you. Oh, somebody's walking. All right. Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hediger, for that wonderful lecture. It's left me with the following question. Is the ability to disrupt cultural markets by thinking with our own hands predicated upon a degree of cultural distance from Hollywood? That is, like, does a nation need an audience, a cultivated audience that desires something beyond cultural indifference? And if so, does Latin America have hope if one of our cultural leaders, Peruvian Nobel laureate Mario Vargas Llosa, claims that the region has become culturally poor and dependent upon the United States, insofar as in the past, culture was a form of conscience that did not allow us to turn our back from reality, but now it is only a mechanism for distraction and entertainment, which seems to me is the void that Hollywood feels and does not allow for the creation of our industry of our own.
Let me start with an anecdote. We spent our last summer vacation in Honduras, and I was conversing with my host in Seinfeld quotes. Some of the people traveling with me were at a loss because they're not Seinfeld fans. But there's a degree of cultural penetration of Central America and South America with American programs that has no equivalent in Africa. There were phases when American films were dominant in Nigeria, but as Victor Okoye said, now we're doing to the rest of Africa what the Americans did to us. So that's a joke, but he basically says we filled that cultural void. Among the achievements of Netflix, I could have mentioned the first films shot entirely in Quechua and Aymara in Bolivia and Peru. Quechua and Aymara are massive indigenous languages. I think Quechua is spoken by 20, 30 million people. And so what we're seeing is Netflix stepping in to actually facilitate that kind of film production that the Peruvian state or the Bolivian state would not normally finance, and those are films that wouldn't have happened without Netflix. And I mean, what we're seeing in Nigeria, and what's really interesting in Nigeria, is that the audience was waiting for those films. And there was an audience there, and it could be found, it could be relatively easily accessed. It's an audience that, in a way, also takes care of the industry. There is a copyright regime in Nigeria, but copyrights are hardly ever enforced. There's a piracy problem, but still the industry survives because Ramon Lobato has done research on this, Brian Larkin too. The audience understands that if they don't pay, the films will cease to come. If you just do piracy all the time, you will dry up the resources for future films. And that is sort of an understanding of the production logic on the side of the audience that's truly valuable. So I think the situation in South America is different and in a way more complex, and the American presence is much stronger. I find it remarkable that Brazil, a country with 200 million people, has a film industry that remains dependent on state subsidies. It's basically, in terms of the cultural production, it's a European country. And I mean, there's global TV and the fiction production, which has a global reach. But in terms of theatrical films, nothing happens in Brazil beyond state-funded production. And that's a real question, why is that? It used to be different. In the late 60s, there was cinema marginal in Brazil. You had genre films that were shamelessly speculative, but also subversive and innovative, actually, and modernist in some cases. And that was a great moment. That, by the way, is also something that interests me. It's always these moments when the industrial logics and the static hegemonic orders are suspended or seem to be breaking. But yeah, I would say that you know, as small as that ray of hope coming out of the two Quechua and Aymara films that Netflix produced is, it's something that should be further pursued. And, you know, 40 million people is enough of a domestic audience to continue. Is that a halfway acceptable answer? Okay.
That was a great question, by the way. And I think part of what makes it great is that it articulates a desire for, if you will, kind of a different cinematic imaginary. And I'm going to use that as a segue to come back to the accidental archive book,
Yeah, yeah.
because I think that it's very compelling, not only in your essay but others, that this is, in a sense, what our contemporary, you know, internet-driven, I always call it the magic box, the culture that's driven by the magic box puts audiences in a position to re-understand how to reconstruct a future for cinema from the shards of cinema's past. And I wondered if you could say a few more sentences about that.
Yeah, thank you. The book that you're referencing came out last summer, and it's a collection of, I think, 37 essays or something on various projects related to precarious film archives, including work in Mexico and Latin America. And the idea there is really that people go out and find archival holdings, not necessarily wanting to be archivists, but they end up being archivists and then start creating new forms of, you know, the memory of the history of cinema that are productive going forward. One of the films that I could have showed is a film by Didi Chico, who is actually taking the film materials that we digitize and that our colleagues in Nigeria digitize in the National Film, Video, and Sound Archive, and is starting to make compilation films about them, about the history of Nigeria and the omissions of the history of Nigeria. Basically, the question of one of his films is, why is there no representation of the Biafra War in that archive? Why does it have absolutely no record of that seminal event in Nigerian history? And so those engagements, accidental engagements, sometimes with physical archival material, sometimes with digitized material, can really prompt new forms of creative work with film that are really important. Yeah.
That's great. Other questions? If we plead, will you ask another question? Not trying to force it on anyone. Oh, here we go. Please, thank you.
Hi, I think I have a simpler question, maybe. I think you mentioned just the lack of scholarship in non-Western cinema, specifically the African cinema. As people go into Ivy League and studying film and media studies, we only have maybe, you know, a few classes that cover non-Western cinema. And in general, I think the engagement with those classes is smaller than the rest of kind of Western history. In your opinion, also teaching like in the Western establishment, how can we change that? And is it okay to be trained in a Western establishment and trying to analyze the scholarship that's not Western?
Yes, thank you. That's actually an absolutely key question. Our department is so small that if I do a course on African cinema, students will come because there isn't a whole lot of other stuff going on. That's one way of solving the problem. You know, you have to create bottlenecks and everyone has to go through there. But it's really also a question of valorization, and I think there needs to be an institutional process of thinking about the value you want to assign to those approaches and to those topics. This is why I quoted Flora Gomes with his radical Amilcar Cabral's statement, you know, if you don't know anything about Africa, you don't know anything. I think that's the kind of challenge that we need to address. I think there's still a very strong preponderance of the Western canon, Western knowledge. It has something to do that, in all likelihood, if you go through a school like this, you will find work in the United States, and you need knowledge that is functional in that environment. And because of the current, still existing economic differential between Africa and the rest of the world, and the continuing effects of colonial and neo-colonial economic structures, not a whole lot of careers that start at schools like that lead to extended periods of work in a place like Nigeria. That's something we cannot change inside the institution or outside the institution, but yes, over time, probably we can. But I think, you know, maybe it's the individual responsibility of the professors to take these matters seriously and think about creative ways of engaging with students to make this part of the curriculum. And again, it's how you define it, how you define the object. Do you define this as somehow a marginal object and put it in the African cinema box? Or do you treat these films as world cinema on equal footing with French cinema, for instance? What I really loved about the Emirates menu was that French films were listed under world cinema alongside a bunch of other stuff. But it was the first map of world cinema that I had seen that radically suspended the privilege of Hollywood and European cinema. And maybe we should design our curricula by looking at the Emirates catalog. You can still have Penelope Cruz in there, as you have seen. I hope that's a useful answer.
That's great. See you. Thank you. Any other questions? Those were spectacular questions, but we can go for something a little less spectacular.
No pressure.
Oh, that was great. So I'm going to imagine that we're in a good place to stop for now and utilize those questions as a way to think about the future. Absolutely. And also the future of our institutions working together, which I think would be a very positive thing. So thank you again to Vincennes, and thank you all for coming, and please be safe in case there is weather outside. Thanks so much.